Welcome very much to this event tonight on a greener, fairer economy. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I just want to do a few bits of housekeeping. First of all, a huge welcome. It's always lovely when people choose to spend an evening with us, whether you're watching it live or later on a recorded version. Now, before I introduce our guests, I just want to set out very briefly some of the context for this evening, because we talk about a cost of living crisis, but really we know this is not entirely a cost of living crisis. It's an inequality crisis. Some people have been doing very well in the last 13 years. In fact, the Equality Trust have done some research that shows since 2010, some millionaires and billionaires have over tripled their wealth, and they've been doing particularly well out of the cost of living crisis. Yet in 2019, we had a UN special rapporteur who said poverty in the UK has been both systemic and a huge injustice. We know that there are people living in this country who are struggling every single day, from marginalised and vulnerable groups who cannot face any more years of this Conservative government. If you're on this call tonight, you probably don't need me to spend a lot of time telling you what a disaster 13 years of austerity has been. But one thing I would just say this in the introduction is Liz Truss's economics that crashed our economy was not an accident. That was not exceptionalism from a Conservative ideology. That was the natural extension of what the Conservatives believe in and what happens when a free market is just allowed to ride free without caring about people or planet. So then some people will look to the main opposition, which has been the Labour Party. But we know that Keir Starmer has U-turned on so many pledges, not just on the environment, although that's obviously very important to us, but he's even refusing to scrap the child benefit cap that could lift 250,000 children out of poverty. So we have this situation where both Labour and Conservatives are utterly failing us on a greener, fairer economy. And that's where the Green Party can really step in. We know there's no environmental justice without social, racial, and economic justice. And tonight we'll be exploring particularly economic justice. But as the saying goes, these things cannot be taken apart. So I'm sure we'll be discussing all of them this evening. That's enough from me. I want to introduce our panel. First of all, we have Chesca Walton. Chesca has been doing a brilliant job as co-chair of Green Party Women. She's also a parliamentary candidate for the Green Party, so one of the people we hope to see as a future member of Parliament. And she's also in charge at My Talu. I'm saying in charge, I'm just double checking her actual description, although I've probably just given her a huge promotion. She's head of finance and ops at My Talu. Welcome, Chesca. We also have Hamza Egal. Hamza is involved with the circular economy. He's a green activist, and he's been recently appointed as the party's equity, equality, diversity and inclusion manager. Welcome to that role, and thanks for joining us tonight, Hamza. And finally, I'm sure she needs no introduction, but just in case, thank you. We have Molly Scott Cato, who is a former MEP and Green Party finance and economy spokesperson. Welcome to you all. I'm going to go first of all to Chesca. This question is for the whole panel. When we talk inequality and the economy, what does that mean to you?
So I'm going to start by saying something which is often overlooked or not realised, and that's that people sometimes don't realise how expensive and time-consuming it is to be poor. Being forced to use prepayment meters, as people have been during the extortionate fuel bills, not being able to buy food in bulk or take advantage of special offers, not being able to plan ahead for the long term. These things make life even harder for those on low and uncertain incomes. And the old trope that we have equality of opportunity in this country is just a fallacy. And our current economic framework, as it is increasing that gap between rich and poor. And some people are fine with that, but I want to explain that it's a problem because it actually increases instability, both politically and economically. It makes the good times higher and makes the recessions tougher. It's also contributing towards global warming and all of the crisis that we've seen across Europe this week. But moreover, it's fundamentally unfair. And as you outlined in your introduction, inequality is a political choice. You mentioned Labour U-turns, and one of the straplines that they've been using is asking the public if they feel better off than they did 5 or 10 years ago. And for me, that's just not good enough. I want people to consider another question. Are you happy that people in your country, in your community, are choosing between heating and eating on a daily basis. We know that growth isn't the solution to that problem, as Labour pretend that it is, because if it were, we'd have eradicated poverty during the Industrial Revolution. We've been through so much growth over the past 100 years, and it's just not solved the problem. So the green solution to that is putting social justice at the core of every part of our policy making, including the economy chapter that we're currently rewriting. And as part of that, we'd ensure that everyone has what they need to live a decent life and have a safety net, whatever happens in the economy.
Thank you very much, Chesca. That was a really powerful opening, and I think a good demonstration of exactly why we need more Green MPs like yourself in Parliament. Hamza, if I can come to you with the same question there around what does inequality and economy mean to you?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I think I've come to an understanding that our global economy is broken. It is no longer fit for purpose. It requires a drastic redesign. It is very focused on extract, use, and throw away. So we're constantly just dwindling and chewing away at the planet. And all that is for the chase of what I call, the perpetual growth disease when it comes to capitalism. Being from the global south myself, I can tell you that I've seen the impact that it's had in sub-Saharan Africa. I see now quite vividly the impact it's having on the UK. And we need to understand that the system was something that was created for a past era. It's gone past its sell-by date, yet we can't question it. That's another thing that I find very kind of amazing when we discuss. We can discuss everything, and we find fluidity in everything, and we can agree on what new directions to take, except for our economic structures. And that's because our relationship with government is broken. Our relationship with each other is broken. We tend to see things from a very small perspective of it's just us. We have to look at how interconnected we are in terms of our economy. So, for example, again, I'd like to go back to the global south and mention where huge, biological and ecological degradation is happening simply because of the extractive industries that have been in place since colonial times. So these inequalities have been allowed to grow. They've created such an unfair system that now it's impacting even people in the global north. I wasn't expecting to see the amount of homelessness that I'm seeing, and people are using Brexit and COVID as excuses. These things have only exacerbated our decline because we have ensured that we have not invested in people, we haven't invested in infrastructure, but we've been selling ideas of what a green economy looks like. My personal take is, what do we do in the transition? And that's what I really want to focus on from a social economic perspective, from a climate justice perspective, and how can we go back to producing things that are relevant for us today, that we need, that are necessities. And we do it internally and in partnership with the rest of the world that we need to work with. So policy is key, but more it's about ideas and bravery now. We need to be brave about our economic ideas. We need to be brave about our solutions. And I would like to see a large growth in thought leadership from a diverse perspective. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Hamza. And I really appreciate your emphasis there on bravery, because we often talk about political courage to do the right thing. We've also sparked off lots of questions there. Just before I come to Molly, just to remind everyone that if you'd like to put a question to the panel in the second half of this session, then please do put it in the Q&A box. If you have technical difficulties, then put that in the chat. But any questions, please, in the Q&A box so people can vote for them. And Molly, if I come to you finally, I think a lot of people will remember that amazing moment you had in the European Parliament that literally went viral, where you talked about being an economics professional. So for you, what does the economy and inequality really mean?
Well, just to say, I can see the questions coming in, and there's quite a lot on finance. So I'm going to end up like Rachel Reeves saying I can't answer that yet. But anyway, we'll get to that a bit later. So just as an opener, I mean, this is really the issue that brought me into politics, because obviously, you know, I love nature. That's why I'm a Green. But it was really a sense of injustice that's always driven it's been my political energy. And that's really why I became an economist. And I've always felt completely outraged that some people come into this world with huge advantages just because of random chance of you know, where they're born, who their parents are, which country they're born into, and that they can use that advantage then to gain more advantage and power over other people. And that's really what I see is where economic justice comes from. It's structural. And I know we're going to talk about that later as well. And that's always enraged me, and you know, that's really what's caused me to get involved in politics and to become an economist. And what I like about the Green Party's approach to economy is we go absolutely back right down to the fundamental questions here. We're not even anti-capitalist, because we sort of, our critique really predates even capitalism, you know, asking completely fundamental questions about why do some people own land and other people not own land? Where does money come from? You know, we're really asking those fundamental questions. And unless you do that, you're not going to be able to move towards a socially just world and a fair economy. And so, you know, I'm a huge fan of the Green Party's economic policy. Some of it I've helped write myself. Most of it was there when I got here, and I just sort of feel I'm a steward of it and a guardian of it. And when I first started looking at it, some of it was like, what on earth's that about? Because it is so radical. It takes you a while to think through it, but it really does repay consideration. I think to me, it's our most important and most impressive policy. And just to say as well, I know we'll come on to the global question later, but I think growing up in the UK, you do realise that you have a fundamental responsibility for global injustice because of our colonial history. And we're still reinforcing those, you know, the structures that dominate the world economy and the trade system, they're still reinforcing those structures of exploitation. And so that's something I think as Greens, we also recognise and acknowledge and take responsibility for and have policies to deal with. So it's not just about a fairer, greener country, which, you know, we're all working with at the moment, but also a fairer, greener world and a fairer, greener global economy.
Thank you. And I'd just like to stay with you, Molly. So I said at the beginning how we often almost feel like we don't need to critique the Conservatives' economic policies because they're so awful, but we absolutely do need to. But in London, for instance, with the Labour Party, I scrutinised London Mayor Sadiq Khan, and I remember a moment recently where I asked him to condemn the use of private jets, and he wouldn't even condemn that. He just was not willing to talk about wealth. So on one hand, we know that we need to criticise the Labour Party and the Conservative Party for their economic policies, but it's also a fair suggestion that we also need to put forward positive ideas and policies for our green economy. So what are some of your favourite or key green policies around the economy?
Favourite policies? It's all my favourite. No, I completely take on board what you're saying, Zack. It's really weird how the Labour Party, which was a party of class critique, has moved into being a party that's afraid to criticise inequality. And obviously the older members of the audience will remember Peter Mandelson saying, you know, we're intensely relaxed about people becoming filthy rich. And as Greens, we're definitely not intensely relaxed about that. And one reason is, you know, we're appalled by the inequality. But the other reason is that the super rich are driving planetary destruction. They're responsible for an overwhelming amount of emissions, private jets, you point out, but the richer people are, the more energy intensive their lifestyles are. And so the transition to a fairer economy will actually enable people on lower incomes to live in a more energy efficient way, because we would pay for their homes to be insulated. Just as one example of that, you know, we would invest in public transport so it was easier for people to get around and so on. But just a few data now backing up what you were saying. There was some really shocking data from the Brookings Institution relating to the period between 2010 and 2020. And they found that if you look at the richest 2% of people, they had actually, of the increase in the size of the economic pie, they had taken 65% of that increased wealth in the US, and 51%, so half of it in Germany, and 33% in the UK, which kind of makes you think we're slightly better off. But obviously what we're talking about there is the richest and most powerful people in society grabbing most of the wealth. And you know, what we say is we need to tax that wealth away from them. In fact, we strongly support a wealth tax on the super rich. But even if we introduce that tax, they would still continue to get richer because they're accumulating wealth at such a speed. And it's the nature of wealth accumulation in a capitalist economy that once you have it, you keep accumulating more. And so a tax actually on the assets of the richest 1% would bring in tens of billions for us to spend on the green transition, but the richest people would actually still be becoming richer. And it's really extraordinary to me that Labour are not supporting that policy. It's such an obvious thing to do right now. And there are other ways in which we can make the tax system fairer and make sure that that richer people are paying more. Because at the moment, a sort of marginal tax rate, poorer people pay more than richer people. And one reason for that is that income on earnings is taxed more heavily than income on assets. So if we switch that around, we would bring in 16 billion a year. That's probably twice as much as it would take to settle the public sector wage disputes that are going on at the moment, just to give you a sense of that. And if we extended national insurance, if we removed as you get richer, you pay less national insurance as well. The rate goes down once you earn more than about 42,000, which is also absurd. So there's another sort of at least 10 billion we could bring in to fund to fund increases in welfare benefits or pensions or whatever. So what I think is really extraordinary right now is you've said these things on the media, I know, Zack, and when any of the leaders or candidates go out and say them, everybody's like, yes, of course, that completely makes sense. What's really surprising is that Labour is so reluctant to pick up any of these policies. And we have Rachel Reeves coming out and saying, there's no money to pay for that, when we're sort of screaming, what about a wealth tax? Because, these are political choices, and Labour are making a political choice to keep our country as a very unequal country. And Greens would definitely introduce changes to the tax system that would move us rapidly towards a more equal society.
Thank you. I think that was a really good outline of how transformative Green Party economics or green economics really would be. And in fact, that's a good segue for me to say to everyone on this call that if you're not a Green Party member, joining the party is one of the most powerful things you can do. Having more members, it means that the media take more notice. It means that we grow the movement. It means that we get more people elected. So if you're enjoying this conversation and you're thinking this is the kind of society that I'd like to see, then please do consider joining the party. And in fact, the link will be in the chat very shortly. Chesca, if I can turn to you. Now, there's that old phrase that the Tories often put out that was, we were all in it together. And we know trickle-down economics was nonsense. And there's this idea that we're all in the same sea, but we're not all on the same boat. And we know that there's massive disproportionality, whether it's the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap, racial pay gaps. These things have real structural inequality in them. So I guess my question to you, Chesca, is how bad is this structural inequality and what can we do about it?
Really big, important question. I'm co-chair of Green Party Women, but I'm also the daughter of a single mother. So I could talk about this for hours, but I'll do my best to keep it brief. I think the problem really stems down to the fact that discrimination is rooted within our economic system, and it's not going to be possible to solve one without changing the other. Women are poorer paid than men, we know that. Even as someone who's highly educated and done everything that you're supposed to do, on average, women like me are still paid 30% less than our male peers. Women are in more unstable employment, even in the UK. Women are far more impacted by inflation that we're experiencing at the moment because they spend a higher proportion of their income on necessities such as food and fuel bills. But also there's the negative consequences such as violence against women goes up dramatically during economic downturns, making their lives even harder and their housing situations even more temperamental than they are. And what this really stems from is the fact that we've still got a real imbalance of power between women and non-binary people and men. So if you look globally, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's 30 of the world's richest men have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of everyone on the planet. And they are all men. So I'm not picking on men this evening, but it's just a fact of the way it is. And I'm almost certain that they're all white men as well. Women own less than 15% of the world's land and less than 20% of homeowners. And sadly, we still don't have the representation of women in political spaces. We're doing better in the UK than we are in some countries, and we'll come on to talk to the kind of global situation a little bit more later, I'm sure. But still, we have challenges with women making their own money. So women tend to invest less, and there's kind of organizations set up around that. But in terms of attracting real wealth and the space that I'm in, which is startups, all founding women teams attract less than 1% of all funding into new businesses globally. And we're living in the 21st century. It shouldn't be that way. So I guess my plea for this evening, if you want to tackle inequality, is ask her to stand, get women in positions of power, and get your daughter saving as much as your boys as early as possible. Thanks, Zack.
Thanks, Chesca. Just because it's so important, I'm going off topic for 30 seconds. But why is ask her to stand so important? What is there something about women? I mean, I know the answer to a question, so it's hard to pose it, but is there something about women not pushing themselves forward compared to men?
Yeah, and there's childhood studies to show that from the moment you can sit up as a woman, you're treated differently than your males. If you go to your local supermarket, you'll see, boys have superhero t-shirts, whereas girls have little princess ones. So we're just not used to putting ourselves forward into positions where we might be scrutinized, or we might need a little bit more confidence. So that's why we need to encourage women, particularly more diverse women from marginalized communities, to put themselves forward, ask them to stand, but also support them once they've put themselves forward. So, if you know a woman that's going to a hustings, offer to babysit the kids, offer to, pay for their transport there and back, things like that can really make the difference.
Thanks, Chesca. Such an important message. And of course, I say it's off topic. It's really not, because until we have representation that's as diverse as the world is, then we won't have policy that represents every single group. That links to the question, really, Hamza. So to come back to it, is around structural inequality. How deeply embedded is this in our society, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think it is entrenched. And if we look at it from let's look at it from just a UK perspective before we look at it from a global or global South perspective. Right now, what we have in the UK is, and these are statistics I think that are coming out now more frequently, is that we have one of the largest proportions of low-skilled workers amongst advanced economies. That means there's been zero investment in education. There's been zero investment in vocational education. We're talking about a green economy when we haven't been creating a green labor force, or even a force to transition our economy from this waste dominated one. And now, if we go back to how we look at it from an equality perspective, let's just say today's conversation. I know Labour doesn't care because it's inheriting everything that the Conservatives are leaving behind, good and bad, including all the illicit money and all the corruption that they've overseen over the last 13 years. We're looking at the question here today is, do we reduce poverty or do we reduce emissions? And the question that debate has been galvanized and it's been glamorized, and you see all the people that, and as Jessica said, we have, I think, about 27 billionaires controlling more wealth than 3.8 people around the world. And that is the same group of people who are coming around and telling us that they have solutions now. And we're going to take all this money that we've looted through our illicit businesses, and we're going to now reinvest it. It doesn't work like that. We've got to hold the government accountable. They've been allowing these people to get away with blue murder, basically. And in essence, it's no longer about whether are we reducing poverty or reducing emissions. I say, let's go and let's deal with the greed. Let's deal with the greed. Let's bring back some amount of wealth to go into social economic growth and development in the UK, in the areas that we understand that we've been lacking because of institutional racism, because of the fact that we've inherited capitalism on the back of slavery, on the back of colonialism. Today, more leaves with the global South than comes in from donations. I think it's $1 that comes in for every 27 that leaves the global south. So if we rejig the economy and we say, guys, we made a mistake, the global south and the global north, we need each other. How can we create an economy that allows us to thrive and to ensure that we have a circular system? And this is, I think, one of the things that we don't talk about is how do we transition? We are coming up with very good policies and we're coming up with very good ideas in the governance space. And that's why the Greens are really on the toes of Labour and everybody else. But what do we do to transition from this destructive capitalist economy that we are all aware of to where we need to be, which is a green economy? And in between, we're being lost in the conversation. We are not looking at basically dealing with our waste. In fact, we're dumping it more in the global south than ever before. We are not thinking about end of life cycles of products. Legislation needs to come in for us to be able to kind of like, fixing something doesn't destroy your warranty. Simple things that kind of like enables us to ensure that we have an end of life cycle of all these huge products that we keep churning out. And again, we have a huge gap in terms of, I would personally love to go back and learn a trade where I can use my hands, simply because we live in a finite planet and we are no longer able to just basically throw things away. One of the businesses that I've been involved in, for example, which is based on redesigning food systems in sub-Saharan Africa and looking at what that really means, is can we reuse mobile phones? Can we just reuse mobile phones? Can we just create those little things to last longer than when the next version comes out? Because we have to change the way we spend our money. And that means that there is a gap in how we communicate what's necessary in terms of our economics. The Green Party has an amazing ability to do that, but we really need to come up with some very innovative ideas, allowing us to connect with the global south and building on what we call the Commonwealth, which was part of maintaining the inequalities and the Eurocentric economies that excluded the global south and people from diverse economies. If we can find a way of just balancing that out, and Britain has the ability to do that, we should play towards our strength and find a way of enabling ourselves to become relevant in the global discourse. You mentioned earlier, the International Monetary Fund, for example, gives so much to the global north at 0%. But at the global south is basically controlled and given unrealistic terms. And those terms have been detrimental to all of us. And you're seeing this huge migration. Then you're seeing populist politicians using that to affect. If people actually understood how bad people are suffering in the UK, there's still this understanding of, I will make it there. Yes, you will. It's better than so many other places on this earth. But the huge amount of poverty in the UK needs to be addressed. And we need to do it by understanding how and why we need to do it. So sorry for rambling on, but I think we're on the right path.
You never need to apologize for saying out the circular economy in a Green Party meeting. I think lots of the audience will have understood and appreciated. And for those who maybe haven't come across the concept of circular economy before, I think it's really important that's there. Just one reminder to put any questions that you have in the Q&A and also to upvote questions. I just have a couple more questions from the panel, and then we're going to be throwing it over to you guys where I'm going to be asking your questions. So do vote those questions up. There's also been a lot of conversation about policy. This is a good moment to mention Green Party policy is decided at Green Party conference. I would argue we are the most democratic party that is a national party in British politics. All our policy is decided by the members. It is one member, one vote. So you can go to Green Party conference, we debate policies on the floor, and then there is a vote. And if it is voted through, that is then Green Party policy. That is 6th to 8th of October. And I'm sure there'll be a link in the chat if you would like to come to Green Party conference. You can also hear from some of our candidates there who are running to be Green MPs. So I'm talking about people like Sean Berry, who's running in Brighton Pavilion, Carla Denyer in Bristol Central, Adrian Ramsey in Waveney Valley, and of course, Ellie Chowns in North Herefordshire, as well as many of our other parliamentary candidates across the country. Molly, if I can come back to you, we talk about this idea of a just transition. Firstly, if you could maybe unpack that for anyone who's not heard of the phrase just transition before, and then once you've unpacked it, how do we get there?
So the idea of a just transition is to say, yes, we're going to be moving towards a radically different economy over the next decade or two, but at the same time guaranteeing that people will have secure jobs and secure livelihoods as we make that transition. And, it's contrasted with the sort of appalling movement that happened during deindustrialization in the 60s and 70s, where a lot of people and communities were just destroyed. That's not what we're talking about. Actually, the green economy offers people good quality jobs and well-paid jobs and skilled jobs. And that's what our investment, large-scale investment in the transition will create. In fact, we might embarrass ourselves by creating quite a lot of growth, which wouldn't be our objective. But if it was green growth, then we would live happily with that. But I think just to talk about the transition, I think obviously the transition we're seeing now is very much in terms of energy. So we've massively decarbonized our electricity system by shifting from coal to gas. Obviously, we would have said we should have shifted to renewables, but we're on that transition path. We're not transitioning yet in terms of public transport. We're hardly making any progress there at all in terms of the sort of ratio between mobility and CO2 emissions, and that's got to be the next priority. But we're also talking about transitioning in terms of the sorts of things Hamza was talking about with circular economy, not wasting resources, making sure that the resources that we use in our economy are extracted in a just way. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And there is legal work being done there. For example, the Conflict Minerals Directive that my colleague in the European Parliament, Eugis Sargentini, put forward, means that you can't now have minerals from conflict zones in any products in the European market. But obviously we need to go a lot further than that. So that's just a start, but it's a pointer about the sort of policy we could be introducing. But I would just say, the three jewels in the crown of our economic policy, between them, really bring about the transition. To me, they're kind of transitional demands because they make sense in the economy we're living now. But if we actually introduced them, we would have transformed the economy. So I'll quickly go through those, won't take too long. The first one is land value tax. Now, why is that important? To me, that's a marker that says there's no reason that some people should own land. And of course, to an economist, land means all the wealth of that land, so the resources in that land as well. Some people should own that and other people shouldn't. So if some people own land, they pay a tax on that to the Commonwealth so that we can all benefit from those resources. Just a recent example of this is the fact that as we put up more wind turbines, because the seabed belongs to the monarch, actually, because go back to 1066, this hasn't really changed. This is so bizarre and bonkers, to be honest with you. But because the king owns the seabed, therefore every time somebody puts up a wind farm, they pay him rent, and his stash increases. Now, we challenge that fundamental issue of who has the right to own land, and we say land should be held in stewardship, and we should all benefit from that. So that question about ownership is really important. Then we've got universal basic income. And to me, that's the labour part of the equation here, because at the moment, it's basically work or starve. So employers can treat you really poorly because your alternative is increasingly an impossible to access and impossible to live on benefit system. So universal basic income would provide you with that safety net, that basic dignity, so you could live without having to accept an appalling job. So that ends capitalist wage slavery in the labour market, in my view. And the third one is money, which I know there's quite a few questions on this. So maybe I won't go into that now, but just to say because I think you're going to ask me that later when the questions come up, but just to say we have raised significant questions about who has the right to create money. And obviously that is absolutely fundamental, because at the moment we're all chasing after money. But if we had the power to create money, that would completely transform the power relationships in our economy. So to me, those things are all, I'm not sure I totally addressed your question about the transition, but to me, those things are the fundamental changes that would transform the way our economy works.
I think that makes total sense, and we will have the MMT conversation later on, because we hear it on Twitter all the time, and we can see it in the Q&A. I would also add, just obligatory here, that on the universal basic income, I'd like to shout out the work of the University of Northumbria, which is Matt and Adit Johnson, along with a team of academics like Kate Pickett, who are doing amazing work on universal basic income and public health outcomes. And in fact, in London, I've commissioned a report about how you might empower communities through UBI, and I'll pop that into the chat in a moment too. Chesca, if I can come to you with the same question, really, about what does a just transition look like, and how can we make sure everyone's included?
Great. So I'll give you a couple of kind of longer term ideals and then a couple of more practical short term suggestions. So going back to the previous point on discrimination, something which is essential to removing time-old disparities in income is putting care economy at the same level of parity that we do financial services and manufacturing. Women have always done the bulk of care work, normally unpaid. But if we put looking after each other at the center of how we organize our economies, rather than focus on building more and more, not only do we reduce inequality and discrimination, but it also helps solve the climate crisis and a lot of the solutions that Hamza was outlining earlier. And green policies really fit in well here, such as, proper social care provision, universal childcare, support for long life learning, etc., so that you have options as you age. It's also, for me, about delegating economic power to the lowest possible level. Until we get proper parity in governments around the world, I think that's the best solution, because everyone knows that women run local communities and they're always running around doing hundreds of hours of unpaid work, but they know who the really vulnerable people are and where the needs of the community is. So if we give those women more power and resources to get to where it's needed, it helps us really identify and bring up the livelihoods of the most vulnerable people. And then in terms of kind of more practical elements, I had my head in my hands when you were challenging Sadiq Khan on private jets. As someone who worked in the city for 10 years and worked for organizations that used to use private jets, there is never a business need for them. So one thing that we should definitely focus on is luxury-focused carbon tax. Traditional carbon taxes can be regressive, but if we, increase policies that the rich identify with and cause the most damage, then we can fund the just transition. So let's do our best to tax private jets and make sure that everyone has suitable bus travel around the country. And other thing that we could do right away is tax income on capital. That's investments, savings, stocks and shares at the same rate as we tax income from work. That gives at least workers the right and same opportunities that the wealthy have, and really would mean that those who gain income from investments that we might need to protect, such as pensioners, have that protected, whilst meaning that people get a fair wage for the amount of work that they do.
Thank you very much, Chesca. And Hamza, if I can turn to you finally on this question, I suppose I want to add another element to it, which is the global perspective. When we speak to right-wing journalists or shock jocks, that we tend not to want to do, but sometimes in the nature of our jobs we have to, their argument always is charity begins at home. Now, we obviously reject that strongly, but what would you say is the ideal answer to this idea that you can't tackle inequality both here at home and particularly in the global south or countries that badly need our support?
I think that was the argument of the 20th century, when we thought that we were untouchable and our economies were just going to continue growing. Now we've hit reality, and the situation is that in order for us to continue building our economies and adapting to the coming changes, we've got to go back to the drawing board. And that also includes the relationships that we have across the world. So for example, right now, the UK, everywhere you go, there's this promotion of EVs. And we know that EVs, to some degree, are better than petrol cars. But we've decided, because we need to get to this green economy so fast, that we're not understanding that by just going EV so quickly, not only are we damaging ecosystems like the Congo Basin, that is one half of the world's lung, in my opinion, and some of the most unique biodiversity in the world. And, in contrast, we spend billions to try and send telescopes to space because we just don't want to deal with the Africans. We'd rather try and look for the aliens. is not something that's going to work anymore. We've got to go back to the drawing board. We've got to redraw these friendships, and in fact go back, and say, we messed up and we want to correct it, but we need your help doing it now. So by giving, there's not a single African nation that's sitting in the IMF or the World Bank, and yet again we're talking about, if we were to produce green hydrogen that could power the whole world right now, we could literally do that relatively easy with sub-Saharan Africa just by putting the infrastructure together. And it won't cost us an arm and a leg. And that's something that we could both build on in terms of not just creating specialist jobs for the UK, which we've always envisioned that we have and we've sent out to the rest of the world, but also creating industries that would be beneficial for local communities without damaging. So allowing people to earn and have a decent living globally, not just here in the UK, but also in the global South, is part of this economic structure that we've got to put together. We might like to think that we're an island, but at the end of the day, we're so interconnected, it doesn't work. So for example, just to give you another quick example of the kind of detrimental policies that we've maintained that have allowed us now to, we focus on war. A lot of money goes into war. Constantly, we're putting money in conflict. We saw it in Iraq, needlessly, and in fact, that's when I said no to Labour and I pivoted to the Greens, is that there's always money for the wrong thing, but there's no money for taking care of our elderly, there's no money for educating our young, and there's no money to create industries and jobs for our working class. That has to end. There's a social contract that we need to redraw with our government. And I think we need to do it with the backing of the global South, because that's where the wealth comes from. And that's where we need to kind of understand that if we create a lasting relationship, then we would be able to find common ground. And again, for me, it's about economic justice, not just here. It means, dealing with the climate. It means dealing with racial justice. And that's done through coming together. So these policies that we look at that are kind of only insular, we need to rethink those.
Thanks, Hamza. Picking up on that with you, Chesca, earlier you said about power being at the most local level it could be, and that's music to my ears as the former democracy and citizen engagement spokesperson, and shout out to Nate Higgins, who's now doing brilliantly in that role. What do you see as the kind of global perspective here and the tension potentially between that local and international when it comes to the economy?
Yeah, so in my day job, the company that I work for is building a payments platform for Africa. So we have teams based across the UK and a number of East African nations. And bless them, they humour me because they know that I'm obsessed with the environment and the economy. So they ask me, questions based on my interest from time to time. And this was a week where Hackney, which is the borough in London where I live, had brought forward their net zero plan from 2040 to 2030, which was great news. It's not in the way that our green councillors would like it, but it's an improvement. And I asked my Ugandan colleague what his country's or local target was, and he just said to survive. So for me, it's not the fact that charity starts at home. It's really a responsibility and accountability. And as Western nations, we need to get towards living within our share of the planetary boundaries as quickly as we possibly can, to stop doing damage to other nations. And then we can look at supporting them by sharing, patents, technologies, hydrogen, but the first thing for me is to stop making their lives worse, because we see all around the world the effects of the climate crisis and how they're impacting the poorer nations first and hardest. So we need to stop with what we're currently doing. And I believe that a lot of these nations are just working towards middle income, which still would be within their fair share of the planetary boundaries as well. So the fact that we all have to get worse is not true. We need to be more responsible within our actions as people who've been living very well off for a really long time. Be more circular. I'm not saying that everyone's lives are going to get worse. I genuinely believe that, you know, a greener future is a better one. Living more sustainably is going to make us more innovative and exciting. But it does mean that we do have to make changes quickly, and we are going to have to, as Molly was saying, get tax people a little bit more who can bear the burden of that, so that we can invest in that transition.
Thanks, Chesca. I think that's so important, especially the principle that those who have done the least to cause the climate crisis so often are the least resilient and bearing the biggest brunts of the effects of the climate crisis. And it's that simple principle about the polluter pays. And actually, historically, whether it's colonialism or empire, we have done a lot to cause those carbon emissions. And I think it's only right that we pay off our share. That actually links me nicely to a final question for Molly, really, which is, we talk a lot about the wealth tax, but on the other hand, we also talk about carbon tax and that same principle, the polluter pays. Could you outline for those who might not know, what is the carbon tax and any details you might have about it?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I'm grateful to Chesca for bringing this up. There was a time when I was offering a bottle of wine to any of our spokespeople who mentioned this in an interview, because there wasn't enough chat about the carbon tax. But then around COP26, there was a lot of discussion around it. So my offer was withdrawn then. So you're a bit late, Chesca. But no, thanks for introducing that, because I really should have said that myself. So the purpose of a carbon tax is really to create a disincentive in the market by making it expensive to produce CO2 emissions, and therefore to encourage people to move away from using energy sources that are carbon based. And we would set it at quite a high level. We say starting at £100 a tonne and moving up to £500 a tonne by 2030. Now, for comparison, the EU emissions trading system has got to about €90 by now. So this is now, you know, what when we made it as a proposal seemed quite extreme, is now really becoming more mainstream as the climate crisis really starts to bite. And the Zero Carbon campaign has estimated that a carbon tax would raise 27 billion a year by 2030. I think actually that's quite a lot lower than our rate. So again, you know, there's tens of billions of pounds there to play around with, while at the same time creating that incentive in the market. So a couple of caveats with this. One is that obviously when you tax bads, you want the bad to be removed from the economy. So you can't rely on that income in the long term. That really should be true of things like smoking as well, although obviously people carry on smoking. But it's definitely true of fuel duty. So as people move towards electric vehicles, we'll lose that fuel duty income into the treasury. And the same thing will happen with the carbon tax. So the rate will go up, but the yield will probably come down as fossil fuels are removed from our economy. And then the other important thing to say is, as Chesca said, there's a potential here for just increasing prices for people who then people on lower incomes won't be able to afford either their fuel bills or the knock-on costs of a carbon tax in terms of transport of goods and so on. And that's why we're very clear that money that comes in from the carbon tax has to be recycled to increase incomes of those on lower incomes through the benefit system, but also to ensure that they have a lower need for paying for energy bills because we're insulating their homes for free. So that's, you know, it's a strong proposal, both to reduce demand for fossil fuels in two different ways, through at the producer end and at the consumer end, and really recycling money to fund the green transition that we need to bring about so urgently.
Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you to all the panel, because we're going to move into questions in a moment. But I think that was just a brilliant conversation. My head's buzzing from all the ideas, and I'm sure people watching. Someone has also asked if this recording will be available online, and yes, it will be uploaded to YouTube, where you can see both this and previous discussions too. I can think of ones we've had on democracy, on health. There's been lots of conversations, and you might want to backlog on some of the really, really good ones. Just a reminder that you can put questions in the Q&A and upvote them. And a final reminder for now that if you've been inspired by anything you've heard so far, please do consider joining the party. The more members we have, the bigger the movement is growing. I'm going to come to Molly first. We've had, I would say, 3 questions that are all similar, so I will group them together. The number 1 question is from Larry Sanders, who says, Green Party fiscal policy says we must balance our books in the course of a parliament. This is similar to the Labour, sorry, it's just jumped down. similar to the Labour Party, and I think would be dangerous. It could be used to stop the government doing what is necessary for the environment and a decent life for many. What should we do about it? We've also had a similar question from John Coyne, and then from Richard Murphy. Someone put in the chat, is that the Richard Murphy? I think it is the Richard Murphy from Twitter. Government has the power to create money by spending it into the economy, not necessarily tax it back. How should the Greens use that power? So I think questions asking slightly different things, but certainly all in the same area. So I will throw all of those to you, Molly, like a bomb.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it'll be difficult to answer all of this comprehensively in the sort of format we've got here, but I'll definitely do my best. And Richard Murphy definitely existed before Twitter existed, and he was part of the original Green New Deal group. And Larry Sanders, of course, brother of Bernie Sanders, he's a big fan of modern monetary theory, although that's probably really annoying for you, Larry. People always say that, so I apologise. So firstly, starting with Larry's question about the deficit, I think that must have crept into our policy when I was an MEP, actually, because I just wasn't able to keep a track on what was happening with our economic policy. And it does suggest that we take a conventional approach to public spending, which we absolutely don't. And so I would suggest that I'm anyway going to suggest that we bring some amendments to our fiscal and monetary policy to the spring conference so that we've got them ready before we actually launch our manifesto. And it seems to me like that would be a good one. So if you want to email me suggesting where that is and what should be changed, I will definitely see if I can feed that into the process. Now, more broadly on how we're going to pay for, that's the question you always get asked, isn't it, Zack? How are you going to pay for that? They never ask politicians that, they always ask the Greens that. And that's an important part of my answer, because we get particularly grilled about, are we competent on the economy? And that's because we just haven't been in government, so people think we don't know what we're talking about on the economy. And the problem I have as economy and finance speaker is that I always have two answers here. I have a fundamental, principled and right answer, which relates to the ideal green world. And I have an answer that will be understood within the current paradigm and discussion about how government funding works. And the trick we're going to have to pull off in terms of our manifesto is to judge the right position between those two answers. Because if you say something that's too far away from where the public conversation is, you don't get heard, you get dismissed. That's not because I don't want to say that. It's because I know there won't be time to take people far enough to make that full case during the general election debate. So we haven't made this decision yet. This is a decision we're going to have to make. I would say that's a different decision from the sort of Rachel Reeves decision, which is, how much money are we going to get and how are we going to spend it? Because our policies are so radical. We can't get costings for them from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, because they don't encompass our way of thinking about how public spending might work. So it's extremely difficult to introduce these ideas into a costed manifesto. Now, mostly discussion about how you're going to finance things relates to borrowing. So, we won't take the borrowing limit above a certain proportion of GDP, the size of the economy. And we are, I would say, much more relaxed about that than the other parties are. But obviously, as interest rates go up, the cost of borrowing increases. So what we should have been doing is borrowing and investing in infrastructure for all those years when interest rates were really low. That's what other European countries did. That's why Spain has got an absolutely fantastic high-speed rail system. Whereas in this country, that money just went to the super rich, and is why we're living in such an unequal society. So anyway, that's one conversation we probably will have. How much borrowing will we want to undertake? Then the second question is about taxation and tax and spend. I've talked about how we would tax. I think, I think we're fairly clear about that. We're not taxing only to yield benefits and income so that we can spend it. We're also taxing because we don't want to live in a society that's disfigured by inequality. So we see taxation as strategic, carbon tax shifting people away from fossil fuels, also to achieve social objectives, a more equal society, and to generate money to spend. But we have this third way of funding, which is what some of the questions have drawn attention to, which is direct money creation. Now, we argued for that before QE became a thing. It's now called quantitative easing, QE, but it's effectively the power you have if you control a sovereign currency to create money directly and spend it into the economy. Our policy on this is extremely radical. So the question isn't, should the Bank of England be independent? We say we would create a national monetary authority, which would decide how much money should be spent. And money would be created, it would be 100% reserve. So you wouldn't be able to create money unless you had money there to back it up. And it would be, all money would be created through the public monetary authority rather than private banks having the power to create money. Now, that is an ideologically pure position. Shelley had that position. And the reason he held that position was he said it was wrong that people who borrow money, in other words, have less money, then have to pay interest to people who've loaned them that money, in other words, have more money. So whenever you're creating money with interest-bearing debt, you are automatically transferring money from poorer people to richer people. That's wrong. I think our ideological position is right. Richard Murphy recently produced a blog which travelled quite well saying that this was nonsense. But he and I have been in conversation, and I think what we need to do is resolve. I think probably we do need to move away from that purity of position and move closer to the way actual monetary financing and money creation works now. And again, the question is for us, how far do we move? How much do we say we're going to create money to finance the spending we want to do through this direct money creation compared to borrowing, compared to taxation? We haven't resolved that issue yet. It's still a conversation. And I would say when we're having that conversation, I'm also very aware that the other hat I'm wearing is external communications coordinator. And I'm very sensitive of the fact that we need to be able to justify that in a world where mostly this conversation doesn't happen at all. So yeah, that's a very difficult decision to make. But we definitely take a much more radical position, and we do acknowledge the importance of money creation. But we're going to have to decide how much of that we include when we produce our costed budget compared to the other two ways of financing spending.
Thanks, Molly. I'm mainly reeling from the idea that people existed before Twitter from that answer. I just add more seriously, though, Molly, as Green Party politicians, that's a question we get asked all the time, how are you going to pay for this? And actually, I feel like talking about a wealth tax and a carbon tax when you're given 60 seconds is very doable. How to talk about money creation in a credible way that challenges the entire deficit myth and changes a huge kind of ideology that's baked in with mainstream media is a challenge. And that's not excuses. It's a challenge, we're moving to work on. But exactly as Molly says, it's how you balance these things. I was about to move on, but I think, Hamza, you want to come in with an extra point, which is totally fine. Hamza.
Yes, sorry, quick one. I think this is a term that I always heard in Africa and in the global south was state capture. I think in 2008, the crash of 2008, 2009, kind of like highlighted for me now in hindsight what state capture actually looks like. We have people who are not paying their taxes, who are not, who are actively dodging taxes and with the blessings of the state. So finding money has never been the problem. How we use that money and what we do with it in terms of really planning for the future has been left wanting in the UK for a very long time. I mean, we could just say it's because of the Conservatives or whatever, but I feel like we're at a precipice right now when it comes to what money looks like and what that conversation means for the UK, because I feel like Labour is just here to inherit and just basically ride out the storm until the sun starts to shine again. It's not going to happen anytime soon. One, Brexit was, a way of shooting ourselves in the foot or even more. We need to really understand what that means for how we get access to funding. And then again, it's basically understanding what do we need to do about the cost of living right now? There's money available. We're hemorrhaging cash. I think every other day you come across, I think today there's about a figure of 27 billion that's now missing. So we really need to understand, how do we ensure that, yes, we are one of the heaviestly taxed and hard-working communities in the world. And again, we're paying the most for the very least. That is a question I think maybe we need to kind of like dive into further some other time.
Thanks, Hamza. So I'm going to move on to another question now. Just to note how many of these questions were people's names I recognised, both from visiting your local parties and also on social media. And so that's a good moment also to say thank you to everyone involved in the party for everything you're doing, and also those on social media, whether you're in the party or just a supporter. Just kind of amplifying our messages on social media really makes a difference in that conversation. And I think journalists often notice when things are retweeted or shared or whatever the medium of choice is. Twitter is probably not the best example anymore. But thank you again for all of that. So Chesca, I think this is one for you to start off with. This is from Emmy Williamson. Anne Pettifor wrote how the global financial system rules the world, preventing government from having policy autonomy, and that's in inverted commas. Have we really got a realistic chance for changing how the financial system and free markets function? And I know we were both asked this recently when we were on a Q&A together, so I know you've got a pretty good answer for this.
Yeah, well, I think Molly kind of hit the tension on the head, really, with what we can explain to people within the next general election and what we think is the right thing to do over a long period of time. And we know that we need to get to a just transition to save the planet by 2030. And we're already seeing kind of bubblings up of pilots and schemes in pockets around the world that are shifting people's perceptions of how the economy should and is supposed to work. And I believe and I hope that between now and the deadline we need for a habitable Earth, that people's minds will shift and we will get to a point where people can see a different point of view. Now, that's incredibly difficult in the UK because of obviously first past the post. And when you've got the two major parties who are unwilling to entertain any other ideas about how an economy should work. But we see this happen within Scandinavia, New Zealand, different South American countries, different options as to the fact that we don't have to be ruled by the major banks. They don't have to hold us hostage, and it isn't the be all and end all to make them happy. And one of the reasons why the Green Party can be so open and honest about this is because we are funded by our members predominantly rather than big donors. And I think we need to have a more transparent debate about how economic policies are really driven. But again, as Hamza mentioned, that's probably one to table for another time.
Thank you, Chesca. I'm just going to see briefly if Hamza or Molly want to come in on that question. Otherwise, I'll move on. I can see Molly's on mute.
I'll try to be brief about this. I think it's a really important question, and I think you don't know the answer until you've done the wrong thing, because that's essentially what happened with the kamikaze budget. You know, the markets were like, these guys aren't serious. This is unfunded spending. We don't trust this. And that's why, you know, the price of government debt started increasing, and effectively, you know, and there was problems in the pension markets and so on. So that is a market response. The financial markets are running the show. Now, we really do need a transition strategy to deal with that. We had an opportunity to do that back in 2008-9, and Gordon Brown bottled it. And now the financial markets are ruling supreme again, and they're actually building just the same sort of instability. I mean, when I was an MEP, I was responsible for regulating European banks, and you could see the way they hadn't dealt with the instabilities they were creating, never mind the environmental destruction, and there was no real pressure on them to do that. So, but, you know, but they are very powerful. They are running the financial system. And my question, when I'm talking about direct money creation, I don't really know the answer to the question, how much money could you create before the markets lost faith in you? And I think if we move closer to government with the sorts of policies we're talking about, we might well see some sort of speculative attack on the pound, for example, which would be an indication that the markets basically didn't like what we were doing, because we were taking power back to the people, and away from the markets. Now, the fundamental answer to this is that we need to restructure the way the global financial system works. And that system goes back to Bretton Woods in 1944. And effectively, the US was very powerful and negotiated that their currency would be considered the equivalent of gold. And that means they can create an infinite amount of that at virtually no cost to themselves. We have a sovereign currency, but it's nothing like as powerful as the dollar. But the most important thing to say about that system is the only countries in the room were the countries that were winning the war and democracies in 1944. That was an extremely small range of countries, all of them colonial powers, apart from the countries in Latin America who were represented, I think. If you'd see a photo of that meeting, it's a bunch of white men. And so, you know, it's absolutely there that these structural inequalities were built in. Now, a lot of good things were done there, and they created 30 years of stability. But decisions were made that were the wrong decisions. And again, I'm giving an ideal answer for an ideal world. That's what we need to do to challenge the power of financial markets. We need to physically reduce their power and take power back to political authorities. But yeah, people have been saying that for a long time, and it's hard to achieve.
Thank you, Molly. And on the note of an ideal policy for an ideal world, Chesca referred to the problems of first past the post, and I'm the first to always talk about proportional representation. It is also important, though, that I point out that we can win even under first past the post. And in fact, the recent local elections, we won more seats than ever before by quite some way. I don't know if it's always known, but actually Labour went up about 10% in relative gains. We went up 56% in relative gains. And the reason why I'm saying this is we can win a team of Green MPs at the next election. Journalists always ask me if I'm gutted that Caroline Lucas is going from Brighton Pavilion. And it is really sad to see Caroline go. She's got an incredible legacy. But actually, it's also been totally unreasonable that the entire Green movement has rested on one person's shoulders, no matter how incredible. So this is the time to build up that team of Green MPs. And the reason why I'm saying this is if you look in your Zoom chat right now, you can see whether it's in Bristol, North Herefordshire, Waveney Valley or Brighton Pavilion, there are action days that you can sign up and go to. If you've never been to one before, we give you full training. There's often a lot of camaraderie and a real community feeling. So please do get involed with those action days.
You didn't mention the excellent food, Zack.
Oh, and the excellent food too. Absolutely. You get fed nicely. And I can also see in the chat that the team have very kindly posted an interview I did with Aaron Bastani of Navarra Media. Aaron was very unfortunately beaten up today by, it sounds like, a fascist. So absolute solidarity to Aaron. But also, if you get a chance to watch that interview, Aaron interviewed me for about 2 hours. It's an hour and a half interview, so you probably need a cup of tea when you sit down and listen to it. I can see Julia's in the chat saying vegan food, I hope. The leadership team are all vegan, so I'd absolutely advocate for that too. Hamza, I know you haven't answered this question, but Sarah Wren's asked the question that I think we've led into. So I'm going to ask you this question and link the two. Sarah says that she's concerned that the financial markets brought down the Liz Truss government. I'd slightly argue with the question and say Liz Truss brought down the Liz Truss government, but I'll take the point anyway. How can we ensure that the financial markets don't respond in the same way to our policies? Because without their agreement, it would appear we couldn't take our policies forward.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very good question. The thing about policy is that we've really got to pay attention to what we want to achieve with it. What are the objectives? And I think of recent, because of career politicians, such as Liz Truss and the merry band that she represented briefly, it was always about, what can we just churn out? There was no real thought process going into these policies. And that's why you're seeing the fallouts of everything that's been done over the last, let's say, since Brexit. There's no actual thought going into these things. And that's not how you treat policy. Policy has to be something that's crafted adequately with the correct context. It has to have a vision and a strategy for implementation. And then there has to be an evaluation process. There hasn't been any for a very long time in terms of not even just our financial structures, in terms of our food, in terms of our fashion and our clothing, how we're living, our housing, what our education systems look like. There's been very little evaluation. It's been career politicians waking up on whims, churning out these things, and then throwing money at it to make it work. Case in point, the Rwanda policy. It's always about, yes, more money is always available for what they want to push through. Yet money is not available for the actual issues that we need to deal with. We've ended up privatizing our water. We're seeing now the adverse effects of that. We've privatized our energy. We're seeing the adverse effects of that. What we need to do is kind of like visualize what our society needs in terms of basic necessities and work from there. And then have the financial institutions tell them, we don't want to hear it. If you're going to exist here, you've got to meet these standards. And that's what's been happening across the world. And we've got so much to learn from the global south, because the rapid growth, and this is some of the fears that I have, and why I think it was very important for us to understand that there isn't a planet B. There isn't a second chance. This is it. So in Africa right now, we're going through the very Eurocentric growth spurt that we saw because of industrialization. Again, we're seeing it in relatively small groups of people. But the expansion is happening. the degradation is happening. And, because we haven't created that relationship with the global South, other than the heinous colonial one, they're not willing to listen to us. And again, we've also went through a process whereby we've spent a lot of money for policy. Adapt this policy, here's the cash. Policies that have been detrimental to that relationship. So it tends to be a lot of what they call these proxy wars or other agendas. We really need to stop hemorrhaging the cash that we're hemorrhaging because of maintaining archaic structures and capitalist structures of the past, and kind of use that money, funnel it back to new ideas that would enable us to look at our housing, our food, and our energy. And I think once we figure those three out, everything else will fall into place. The banks are not, the end and all of everything. We need to be able to deal with them adequately.
Thank you, Hamza. Chesca, if I can come to you, I think I read recently that Jeremy Corbyn, when he was preparing for a potential Labour government, were having meetings with the Bank of England to assure them that their policies wouldn't kind of scare the markets, and I think was reassured that it wouldn't. Now, I'd argue our policies are far more, I'd say, radical, but also common sense than even what the media was whipping up into quite a storm. Is this a worry about scaring the markets?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern that I think anyone would have when they're looking at our policies for the first time. And I really empathized with Molly in her opening when she said that they do take a little while to get your head around when you're so, as I have been in, my education, indoctrinated into a capitalist way of thinking the economy works. But this is what makes Green Party policy making so different from other parties, in that we're not really run on ideology other than, living within boundaries and social justice. All of our policies are made on research and evidence, and really letting anyone who's interested get around a table and hash out what the best way to develop policy is. And that is, people from all walks of life and all, I would say, left and relatively centrist of the political spectrum. And as you say, everyone comes together and votes on them at the end. So it really is building on the collective knowledge of a lot of really smart people in terms of how we've got to where we are. And people often talk about this, the markets, like they're some kind of uncontrollable entity that's without the remit of anyone. But really, the markets are just a lot of people who are making judgments based on their confidence of other people. And if we can project and explain why we've come to the policies that we have, and prove that they do work in certain cases and where they've been implemented, then we can definitely prevent the instance that we saw last year based on the trust budget.
Thank you very much, Chesca. Just to remind the audience that in these last 15 minutes, please do vote for the questions in the Q&A that you want to hear asked. And Molly, if I can come to you, I'm going to ask a question, but I just want to refer to something that happened recently with Keir Starmer. So he was giving a speech and was interrupted by some young climate activists around the climate emergency and some of his many U-turns, whether it's about oil and gas fields in terms of Rosebank or the £28 billion that they pledged that we don't think was enough, but then rode back on. And without even thinking for a second, his kind of automated response was, I'm on the side of economic growth. So we have a question in the chat, which I've lost temporarily. Oh, yeah, here we go. From Martin Dorr. How can we convince the average person to see the notion of endless growth as a pyramid scheme? Until normal people realize this economic model can't go on, we can't make any kind of transition to a better model. Are we all addicted to economic growth?
Well, yes, we are. It's a sort of religion, isn't it? Growth is the fetish at the heart of the capitalist religion, I'm afraid to say. And it's endlessly reinforced, including by Keir Starmer when he makes comments like that. I would say I'm encouraged that this thing, this argument for change that green economists have been making for the past 30 years is starting to be heard more than it was. That's partly just because growth in the West, at least in the overdeveloped countries, as I would see it, is stalling anyway, because you just can't squeeze any more growth out of the system. And so people are starting to look around and say, well, maybe that wasn't what we should have been doing. I was at a conference a couple of weekends ago in Italy, organised by the EU Commission, focusing on sustainable finance. And one of the top guys that works on sustainable finance raised this question with me, not in a sort of skeptical way at all, but just like, yeah, you've been right about that, what can we do about it, sort of thing. And I was actually very surprised, and we had a really useful conversation about that. I would say, you know, the main thing we say, we don't say, hey, we want a smaller economy, we want everybody shivering around a candle and wearing a hair shirt. It's nothing to do with that at all. What we're questioning is, what is the purpose of the economy? And the purpose of the economy is to make people happy without causing huge impacts on, you know, the other species we share the planet with. Our economy is not doing that. And this chasing of endless quantity at the expense of quality is just an error. We didn't always used to do this. It's in fact it was kind of created for the Second World War, and we did need to maximize output because we were fighting fascism. But it's just got stuck in the system, and we need to take it out of the system because it's a mistake, and it's now pushing the economy beyond planetary limits and causing all sorts of environmental stresses, but also actually psychological stresses as well, both because we have to work hard to keep the capitalist machine going, but also because we're forced to consume all the time and have all that built-in obsolescence. So it's just not working for us. It's just kind of historical error we have to remove from the system, but it's very powerful. And so it's not so easy to do. I would say Kate Raworth has done a great job here in drawing attention to the shifting beyond planetary boundaries, but not necessarily, you know, we still have to make that happen. The first step is making people understand why the growth economy isn't working for them. But the second step is to make those changes. And there's a lot of fundamental changes that need to be made. I would say, you know, a couple of examples of why growth isn't working that you can use if you're talking to people about this. One I like particularly is the fact that if a parent who was looking after their children goes out to work, that you've now sort of created a double increase in the size of the economy because you're paying for the childcare and the person's working. But is anybody questioning whether that's actually best for the child? Is that actually improving human well-being? We would ask the second question rather than just saying, look, fantastic, more growth. Similarly, you know, all the pressure that we're seeing for growth in housing and in development and in building, again, very often that isn't improving human well-being, and it comes at a huge cost. So Herman Daly said, if all the virgin forests of North America were cut down and turned into gambling chips, you know, that would look good from an economic growth point of view. And that summarizes what an absurd measure it is. I would say from our side, we haven't got fully worked through alternatives yet, but we might at least start by removing the negatives rather than counting everything as a positive. So, you know, massive increase in economic growth during COVID because people had to make loads of protective equipment, and there was a lot more activity in hospitals. All of that counted as a positive. Now, that's a stupid measure if you're counting stuff nobody wanted to happen positively. So we could at least net off the negative and make sure we deduct all the impacts, negative impacts on the environment and loss of resources and so on, and also measures of unhappiness. If we started doing that, we would be moving towards a much better measure of our economy that actually works for us rather than, you know, just growth for the sake of growth, which is serving a very small number of people. The only other thing I would say, and this is quite an important thing, is when people talk about GDP, they very often talk about GDP per capita. So if somebody, you know, if you compare Germany and Tanzania, for example, you'd compare that in terms of GDP per capita, but that just divides one number by another number, as if that income was shared equally, which it never is. So there's a false implication of equality there in that GDP per capita measure. So yeah, actually, that measure is in itself concealing the very question that we're discussing at this event, which is inequality.
Thank you, Molly. And you've lined me up nicely to say the thing that I think is always important to say, that even the person who came up with the concept of GDP says that's a terrible way of measuring a country's well-being and happiness. I think it was Jacinda Ardern who did some really interesting work on this, where she said rather than taking one measure, we could look at 5 measures. So looking at things like protecting Indigenous people, how are their rights, what does child poverty look like, tackling the climate emergency, of course, preparing for a digital age, and mental health. So to come on to that, Chesca,
just hang on,
Molly,
Zack, just to say quickly,
pretty much alluded there to.
Can I just say, somebody's dropped in the chat, what about the Human Development Index? And this also relates to what you were saying. Yes, those measures are really important to look at, but if you are being the Chancellor, you do actually need to know how much cash there's as well. So yeah, we need to be measuring economic wealth that we've got to invest, taking into account those other measures. Sorry, I think it's quite important from an economic point of view to just point that out. If you imagine yourself being the Chancellor, you can't spend happiness, sadly. It'd be great if you could, but
okay, I felt your passion leap through the screen. So Chesca, Molly talked there about parenting, and I would also add care work. In fact, I'm reading a brilliant book at the moment called Radical Help by Hilary Cotton that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in this subject, that talks about the fact that parenting is just not included in the economy. And as Molly said there, how you'd essentially have to double account for all the work that's being done. How much does this prejudice against parents and those in the care, doing unpaid care work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see this in particular coming back to the inequality between men and women, that we've started to get to the point where it's pretty much equal up until the time around women giving birth. And we see that with, at the moment, the cost of living getting more and more expensive, people are choosing to have children later and fewer children. And I'm all for people, deciding what their family looks like. But I think we're not in a healthy space where people who would like to have children can't afford to. And people who around the world who are having children can't afford to look after the children that they have. So the solution to that is really a universal basic income, making sure that this really puts in place the kind of foundation that starts to solve a lot of the other problems around distribution of childcare, the choice as to whether you increase your working hours, decrease your working hours, really gives you options to make sure that everyone has what they need. And then coming back to Molly's point around our obsession with GDP growth, what we see is that one single metric really drives the culture of all of the organizations that everyone works for, in that constant fight for growth that all employees feel hitting their monthly targets, their need for a promotion, that kind of constantly trying to get one foot up the ladder really exacerbates the inequalities that we have in our society already, and puts money as the primary choice of what people are making decisions on, rather than well-being or happiness or the health of their families. So I think inequality around childcare and caring, as well as investment in the NHS and universal childcare, which gives people increased choices, really does solve a lot of these inequality problems by a happy coincidence.
Thank you very much, Chesca. I'm going to ask the panel in a moment for just any final thoughts as we wrap up, just anything you really want to leave the audience listening and watching along tonight. Hamza, I know you also wanted to mention something on growth, so maybe if you can mention something on growth and then leave us with a final thought.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think one significant point that we need to really understand and kind of like maybe as a party really push this message is that we know capitalism doesn't work. The UK is a perfect example. The amount of poverty that we have allowed to grow into the system shows that capitalism is not working. And again, it's the growth issue, and this, as I said, this perpetual growth disease is because the very top level of, and again, there's all this figures that's accounted, they're like all this money has been made, but it's just one small percentage where all that wealth actually goes. So all this work Jessica has mentioned and all this that we've been putting into the system and people working, the people who get paid are very small. And that means we need to understand that inequality is essentially an intrinsic system in capitalism. We need to deal with that. We need to understand that the only way forward is to address capitalism as just another system that has come. It's not the holy grail. It's only 400 years old. I think it's a lot younger than even the pyramids, if I'm not mistaken. So we need to get rid of it. And we can do that. And the antidote for that is people power. It's democracy. We should be able to understand and say, this doesn't work for us anymore. The governments cannot force it down our throats. And big business has to pay an equal share. And when I say big business, I mean the guys who've been profiting from the entire globe, not just the UK as a safe haven of tax dodging and whatnot. So that's my kind of like message on that. My final point is that, again, same topic. I think Britain doesn't need to have a conversation about reducing poverty or reducing carbon emissions. What the conversation that we need to have is, how do we deal with greed and how do we bring back British productivity? That's how I think we will move forward and create a very cohesive society, one that's aware of itself and its responsibilities, both internally and externally. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamza. And I'm loving all the chat that's coming through. Particularly my favourite message is from Shelley Saunders saying, this has been inspiring. I'm looking forward to my first Green Party conference I've just signed up to in October. If you are coming to Green Party conference, just to let you know, there is a first timers evening as well, where if it's your first time, you can get together and meet other people who it's their first time as well. So it's a very welcoming environment. And Molly, if I can come to you for your final thought of the evening, please.
Yeah, thanks, Zack. I was just thinking it's a shame we didn't have a chance to reach some of the offshore questions, but perhaps we could have another session on tax avoidance, since the people in the room here seem to like talking about economics. I'm sure we all do as well. My message is, we're right. We should have more confidence. Our policy is radical. It's very well thought through. It's detailed. People spend ages and ages going over it, thinking it through, but we don't spend enough time talking to other people about it. So have the confidence to do that. There's massive problems in our economy at the moment. It's obvious that the conventional way of approaching economics has utterly failed, environmentally, socially, and in its own terms, because we don't even have growth. So I would ask you please to, I'm glad you came to this session. I would ask you please to do some reading from all the links that are going to be sent, and have the confidence, maybe have this discussion in your local party, but also, in your workplace, on the bus, at the hairdresser. Zack knows I always talk to my hairdresser about all these things. Just have the confidence to know that we're right about this, and also maybe think about studying more and becoming a green economist, because I'm 60 now. I'm going to need replacing. So please do that to help me out. Thank you.
You've got a long time yet left, Molly, but I appreciate the sentiment. And I'm sure your hairdresser is an absolute expert in economics at this point, the amount they must hear you talk about it. Chesca, if I can turn to you for your final thought, please.
Sure. So I think one reason I'm really proud to be a Green is that we don't make policies based on punishing people or value judgments, such as the child benefit cap doesn't work, and all it does is punish the children at the heart of the problem. So I just want to say I'm really grateful to my Green colleagues who have taught me in the couple of years that I've been a member to really leave any assumptions or judgments that you may have learn over the years, and really take every policy decision based on evidence and research and what could be, rather than what's always been the case. So thank you.
Thank you, Chesca. I'm going to take chair's privilege and just answer one of the questions very finally, which is from Kim Perry, which says, how do we push a potential future Labour government to support and make policies that the Green Party want and the country needs? I think that answer is easy. We do that by electing more Green MPs, and we get more Green MPs by electing more Green councillors and building up that pace, and we're increasingly doing it. So just one final time tonight, if you're not already a member, the link is in the chat. Please do join the party and get your friends and colleagues to join it. The more there are others, the more we can take this fantastic discussion we've had tonight to the chamber in Westminster, in the House of Commons, get more Greens elected and make sure that we're essentially changing legislation and building a greener, fairer economy. A huge thank you to my guests tonight, Chesca Walton, Molly Scott Cato and Hamza Egal. I don't know why I'm talking like I'm on a TV show. It's not my regular start, but thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to everyone for being here this evening, and hope to see you at Green Party Conference on 6th to 8th of October. See you there, and thank you.